Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in all kinds of turbulence. Shipping lanes shut down by extremists in Yemen, Ukraine still invaded by Vladimir Putin, a momentous election in the United States that could determine the future of what we think of as democracy, human driven climate change,
Nothing was
biodiversity
really on
loss. It's quite a time. Stuart Hart, who is a professor of management at Cornell, I once heard him give a talk centered on what he calls chronocentrism, which is a hypothesis that every era, every generation thinks it's special. You know, that its time is the time. If you go back through history, during the Enlightenment, during the Depression, of course, the greatest generation during World War II. But boy, this does feel, and he said in his talk that this time really is different. And one reason it's different is we're exerting such force on planetary systems as we've surged toward 9 billion people, seeking better lives and extracting resources and living and otherwise. We're changing the planetary systems. And, you know, cyanobacteria did this early in Earth's history and created a great oxygen catastrophe, which is actually one way some geologists talk about that time period. But they weren't looking up and going, oh, wow, what's going on? And that's kind of what distinguishes this moment, this Anthropocene idea from geological and Earth changes in the past, is that there's the species that's doing all the mucking around is sentient. Whether we're sapient, as our Homo sapiens name implies, is still sort of an open question, at least sapient enough to get ahead of ourselves. And I was involved, as my two guests are here, and Jacqueline Gill can't come on, unfortunately, from the University of Maine. I was fortunate to be kind of a witness to the emergence of this idea of the Anthropocene, partially because of something I wrote in 1992 in a book on global warming, where I said, you know, we're in a post-Holocene age of our own making. What we make of that is still an open question, and that's why I was invited to be on this mostly technical committee, the Anthropocene Working Group, back in 2010. Here we have Phil Gibbard, emeritus professor at Cambridge, and Erle Ellis at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who is now in Zanzibar. Joining us from Zanzibar. Phil, where in the UK are you?
Cambridge.
In Cambridge, that makes sense.
I'm at home.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some new papers. There's been a line of new thinking, even as this thing called the Anthropocene has kind of been the concept that there is a change big enough to register in stratigraphy, to register in layers of rock that will be measurable for thousands of generations into the future. That process culminated, and there were some initial votes in support of the idea. There's a misinterpretation in the media, I think, sometimes, that this is a closed case, that this is already officially the Holocene, the period that humanity kind of emerged as a planetary force and is gone, and that this Anthropocene epoch is now here, the one that we're shaping. You see, lots of good reporting. Here's Crawford Lake, has been designated, voted on by that committee, that as this place under geological parlance and rules, you have to have a spot on the planet that is where you can point to strata and say this is the marker. And of course, it's seen as being mid 20th century. But I don't want to get ahead of things. I want to talk to my guests and let them tell you the story of the new emergent idea which actually has been a line of thinking that has been in parallel to this formal geological process, that it's different. It's not an epoch as we think of those in the geological record. It's something else. So let's just get started here. Erle, some of these papers are on your webpage, anthroecology.org, I think. There. And it's really been a series. It's been there was a new paper out, which is the one I have at the right of the screen at the top. The Anthropocene is best understood as an ongoing, intensifying, diachronous event and also an earlier 2022 paper, the Anthropocene is as an event, not an epoch. So tell us a little bit about what you mean and why this matters. Some of this feels very rarefied and dusty, as stratigraphy tends to be. And then Phil, we'll get to you.
Okay, sure. So as I think every viewer should know, I am not a geologist or a stratigrapher. I'm an ecologist. And I'm somebody who's been in the Anthropocene Working Group that has been formally proposing to designate the Anthropocene as an epoch of geologic time in the geologic timescale pretty much since it began. But all along, I've been thinking about the Anthropocene as a process of global change. That's more or less how ecologists think about something like the Anthropocene. But in the last few years, the Anthropocene Working Group had spent a lot of time just studying the concept of the Anthropocene in general. How should we think about this broader concept and the processes that are causing it, and what kind of evidence we can use to define it? But in the last few years, the gears shifted, and we went toward really a deep dive into the stratigraphic techniques that Phil is the master of, stratigraphic techniques for designated geologic time intervals, which is all about the boundaries. It's about breaking time up into units. And the boundary divisions is where the action is. That's where the science is. And now we've come to this point where the Anthropocene Working Group, which I resigned from recently, has decided that the definition of the Anthropocene will be a boundary basically marked in a lake in Canada at 1950, based on plutonium isotopes from bomb testing. So that's basically how the Anthropocene went from being this big concept about human environmental change at the planetary scale to becoming a marker in a single lake in Canada. And for the last few years, this has been going on, this process of getting there. And I've felt very uncomfortable with the idea that we're going to narrow things down so much. I could never see the utility. Anyway, I met Phil directly at one of the meetings of the Anthropocene Working Group. I believe it was 4 years ago, something like that.
The one in Oslo.
It was the one in Mainz, I think.
It was Mainz.
Okay.
The one in Mainz at Paul Crutzen's institute, his Max Planck Institute. Over dinner, we both realized that we were uncomfortable with how the epoch definition was forming. It just didn't feel like this was the way to define the Anthropocene. But as a geologist, I had no real understanding of how a geologist or stratigrapher would think about the Anthropocene, other than what I'd already learned through the Anthropocene Working Group. But Phil very shortly said, no, geologists have other ways of defining geological change processes at the planetary scale that are not just divisions of time in the geologic time scale, like events, geological events, which are of all shapes and sizes. They don't have to be global. But of course, some of the biggest changes, like the one you just mentioned, that have ever happened to the planet, like the great oxidation event caused by photosynthetic bacteria, right? That this kind of change, obviously, you want to recognize this somehow to understand global change, yet it's not done in the geologic timescale. There's no epoch, there's no eon, there's just no boundary recognition for it, because it doesn't really make sense, right? It's an ongoing process of global change. It doesn't have to be everywhere the same all over the place. It doesn't have to have a single marker in a single place. It's defined as the great oxidation event. So the Anthropocene event was something that Phil proposed, and I immediately got on board with as a way of defining the Anthropocene for geologists that wouldn't require an epoch definition, this boundary definition.
Right. Phil, I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to show, I remember at the Anthropocene Working Group meeting in 2016, Martin Head came as kind of an advisor, and now he's on the working group. He presented, I love this slide, which gets at one of the problems with this strict historical approach to delineating a moment in time when the planet shifts from one situation to another. And he pointed to these bridges across the Mississippi River. If the Anthropocene is geologically defined as 1945, the bridge in the foreground is in the Anthropocene. The one in the middle is Holocene and Anthropocene, etc. Just Phil, just walk us through sort of what the rule book is like that they were trying to cram this into, and then how that, again, a little bit more on how that this is a distinguished idea that you now are pushing.
Well, the paper you've just spoken about, it's actually by Stan Finney and Lucy Edwards. Stan is the previous chair of the International Commission of Stratigraphy, which I'm Secretary General of now for another year. And Lucy Edwards is at the USGS, Geological Survey.
Right.
And I think it was Lucy who took this picture, or at least
so great.
This picture. So, you know, credit where it's due, etc. But the concept of formal stratigraphy, which is basically, you know, what underlies the foundation of our division of rocks, which gives us Earth history and some kind of chronology. It's actually a complex of different topics. So it's based on lithology of rocks, including things like color, chemistry, magnetic properties, and anything else, but not including fossils. Then there's a separate classification scheme called biostratigraphy, which is based, in fact, on the assemblages or of fossils. They may be individual fossils, or they may be groups of fossils. And they were this approach, lithology or rock type, if you like, combined with biological contents, was the principal way up till relatively recently that the whole geological column was divided. And because we had no other means of dividing it, basically. But then there's been the development of techniques such as palaeomagnetism, the reversal, based on the reversal of the Earth's magnetic field, which has changed numerous times in geological history, most recently about 780,000 years ago, and some people are even suggesting that it might change soon again, which would mean that the North Pole would no longer be at the North rotation pole, but would be down in the south, and we'd have the South Pole at the North Pole, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so that's another way we can use to divide the rocks, by looking at the magnetism preserved in them. And then there's various chemical techniques which have been used to provide direct numerical ages. And they take various forms, usually based on isotope decay. And there are different elements and isotopes of those elements, which can be used to provide dating in different parts of the sequence. Since we're very, very near the present day, the present interglacial, which is called the Holocene, which is what we're living in at the moment, if we ignore, yes, as you're showing on your slide, if we ignore the Anthropocene question for the moment, was defined, in fact, in an ice core in Greenland. That's a core in the Greenland ice. And that core has been very, very specifically dated numerically, and also using annual laminations, which are present in the ice, to provide a very strong boundary figure of 11,700 years ago. And that of course number will increase by 1 year as we go into the future. But basically that boundary is very clearly recognized not only by the geochemistry, but also by the annual laminations, as I've mentioned, but it's also seen in a number of other ways. So it's a very clear boundary between the end of the last ice age and the present interglacial period, which is what we're living in today. So that's the basic structure of the geological timescale. And one more thing to say, and you can see that in this slide as well, the timescale divisions are hierarchical. The largest of the divisions is the Phanerozoic, which is, in other words, the period for which we have fossils, and that begins at about 650 million years ago at the base of the Cambrian. And then if we come down the scale, down the stairs, as it were, we have things such as the divisions you see on the slide, Pleistocene, Pliocene, Miocene, or one example, and then you see themselves subdivided into smaller and smaller groups. So there's a series of structures which are hierarchical, which in a way are developed to support the division scheme, because we see, this kind of hierarchical structure within the rocks themselves. So this, in a sense, is developed. This whole structure is developed to reflect what we see in reality. And it was really, although many of the terms were defined even in the 19th century, and some of them even before that, today these terms are established, and the divisional schemes are administered by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which again, as I've said, I am currently the Secretary General of that group, and we are a commission of the International Union of Geological Sciences, who are our boss, and the buck, as it were, stops with them.
Yeah. So I want to pause for a second because and Erle's work, a lot of your earlier work, got into broadening the question of when this all began, given the other large perturbations of the Earth system humans got involved with a long time ago. Bill Rudiman is one of your co-authors on these papers, and goes back thousands of years in terms of methane release and climate, and this extinction of species and humans in the Americas after the invasion, the occupation, colonization. But I want to me, as a journalist coming at this, and even when I was on the committee, like Erle and Phil, I think I had lots of questions. One of the biggest questions was, how do you define this kind of juncture when it's just at the earliest, like nascent little beginning part of the slope? And I asked Jan Zalashevitz, the founding head of the Anthropocene Working Group that worked for the organizations Phil was just describing. I asked him this question back in 2011. I'm just going to play this video.
Geology is retrospective. Yes. And it seems hard to be able to justify, well, I'm sure there'll be some gray-haired geologists who will say, well, how can you know something has begun and will be significant when we don't know how long it will last, for example? Is that some kind of, that's not part of this paper per se, but how does that fit into how you plot this out?
It's one of the many novelties, of the Anthropocene geologically. No, we don't know quite how the Anthropocene will pan out. What we do know is that sufficient change has already taken place, to say that the course of Earth history has changed and that the strata have changed. How much they will change, will depend on numerous feedbacks, not least the kinds that we ourselves as humans will introduce, in years and decades and centuries to come.
So I love, to me, it's like predictive geology. Even the debate, even looking at your paper, which describes this as an emerging long-term, a moment that's kind of a wedge that's building forward. Does this make it problematic, or Erle, how do you grapple with the fact that you're trying to put a name on something that, well, I remember Brad Allenby described it. He says, we're trying to tie geology to a windstorm, meaning human events. Oh, you're muted.
For me, the interesting questions about the Anthropocene have never really been about when. They've always been about why and what. Like, what is actually happening? How can we assess this? And most importantly, though, why do we have this time in which a single species is causing this transformative change at global scale? Like no other species has done this. Even with the Great Oxidation Event, this was not a single species, right? This was many species over hundreds of millions, billions of years, right? This is a very long, drawn out process. And the original species that began photosynthesizing and oxygenating the atmosphere almost certainly went extinct as a result of the oxygen they released. So there's a lot of big picture questions remaining about what the Anthropocene is going to be about. And those are interesting questions, and they're pertinent now. They have, and as Jan mentioned, right, it really does depend on what human societies do in response to the knowledge that we have become this planetary transformative force. That's a new realization as well. And in many ways, I find one interesting way to put it is that the Anthropocene begins when you realize that the Anthropocene has begun. And the Anthropocene has been successful, I think, as a word, in that it's actually been adopted by so many people and used in so many ways. And given the fact that it is still this kind of open-ended process, we don't know where the Anthropocene is going. So it's hard to define, what are going to be its biggest transformations. What are the things that will be, looking back on it, what will characterize it? I think it is important to, that it is about human societies and people in human societies are now waking up to the realization that there's really no way to do anything without changing the planet. Yeah. What comes next is even more interesting. And it's not going to be, a lot of people want to characterize the Anthropocene as this kind of existential crisis in which everyone is at risk of somehow dying out in some kind of, in our lifetime, say. And I think that's really a total cop-out. That is not the reality. This is going to continue for a very long time. We don't know what it's going to look like, but the idea that human societies are somehow just going to leave the playing field and go away as transformers of the planet, that's not going to happen. The only question is what we're going to do. And that's up to us. It's up to, what human societies do.
Yeah, long ago, I wrote, the best thing about the Anthropocene, Crutzen, Stormer making this point, and is the conversation that's emerged around it. It's spilled into all kinds of fields: sociology, politics. There's the Capitalocene of Moore at up in, I think, in Binghamton, and that to me is really I'm just echoing what you just said, Erle. And what I hadn't thought about this, but basically, a point you just made is that the future isn't written in stone. Maybe that's the good news, is that it will be. Like, well, it will be, right? But the nature of that future. In fact, Phil, I had this thought at some point. You could end up with a sort of a blank record of human activity after this emergent early part of the Anthropocene. It's in two ways. One is if we do sort of wipe ourselves out, and the other is if we get our impacts or shrink, if we detach from nature in some way or other. We could go quiet as a species and not leave a record in the rock also. So
I think we should be careful about the way we think about nature and natural too.
Yeah.
Given that, if we were talking about this around a fire, 1,000 years ago, I don't think anybody would imagine that we are somehow distinct from nature. We're just another animal living, a little differently. We do live differently. We change the environments that we live in much more than other species. But this whole idea that we're somehow completely separated from nature is a pretty novel idea. And in fact, I think the more accurate description of the human relationship with nature now is that we are part of nature. We always have been. And now we're part of a force. We've reached a stage where human societies are so large and so coordinated that we have become a global force. But, you know, climate is a global force. The human system is now a global force, but it's a force of nature. It's the nature of this planet now, is the Anthropocene nature that we have.
Right.
Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong, doesn't make it good, doesn't make it bad, but it is a fact of life. It's a fact, like life on Earth, human societies are a big player in what goes on.
That's pretty evident. Phil, what do you think about this question? I guess one thing I'm sure, well, first of all, let me note that as a comment that came in, Donald Carswell says, I'm glad he addressed the use of the Anthropocene concept as a negative. I think it's an example of human possibility and gives us an idea of what humans can be capable of, for better, I'd add, for better or worse. So Phil, you've been in the middle of this, and for the average person, does epoch, era, event matter? How does this play out for you when you think about it, when people ask you questions?
Well, actually, I was at the start of this. I initiated the Anthropocene Working Group, but 2009, in fact. Well, of course, for the average person in the street, or as we used to say in this country, the man on the Clapham omnibus would not be particularly bothered about these questions of status and hierarchical position. But the problem is, and Erle's already touched on this, and that is that the word has already got out. It's escaped. It's not simply something which geologists can control, and perhaps shouldn't be controlling. Right. This is something which is, we see in the newspapers, we see it on TV, we see it in magazines. And for many people, the question of definition is at best a very loose concept, which for scientists is not satisfactory at all. But of course, in a way, it's too late. I mean, this discussion has been going on, well, for at least 1.5 decades. And in that time, there's been a great deal of publication, of course. I'm sure you're aware. I mean, we see books coming out every day, and I've just got an article today in Nature Geoscience, which is talking about Anthropocene on the moon. And of course, there is actually Anthropocene on the moon. There are used cars up there. So, and other such pieces of equipment, which, could be, in a geological sense, could be used to correlate, could be used to demonstrate some point in time. But for geologists, it's extremely important to have fixed boundaries, and those fixed boundaries are about communication. Don't forget, we're dealing with a worldwide situation here when we're dealing with nomenclature. And, we need to know that people in China, Russia, India, wherever, are all speaking from the same piece of information. If, it's, you don't need me to tell you that, you need these kind of fixed points in time, in the way that we have fixed points to define what 1 meter is, or what 1 liter is, or 1 gallon, if you prefer the old-fashioned measures, or whatever. I mean, we need to be able to strictly control these questions, and that's why geologists have always gone for defining fixed boundaries. The interesting thing, though, is the hierarchical structure, which I talked about earlier, has been not really developed for anything that's happening close to the present day. It's happening for things in deep time. And what we're doing is we're adapting that structure to very, very near the present day. You already mentioned about Holocene and Anthropocene, and if we place the boundary, I think the current position, which is being proposed, is actually 1952. Well, I was born in 1949, so that makes me Holocene. And I think this is a point which we have to bring to the public, and we have to say, look, if our colleagues are determined to define a fixed boundary, and that fixed boundary is in the 1950s, then what happened before? Why are we putting a fixed boundary in one place which is in less than a human lifetime? Were you aware that you lived through such a boundary? And
Right.
I think most people would turn around and say no, who did in fact live through that boundary. Most people would turn around and say, I never noticed. I was too busy going to work or studying or whatever people do, with their lives. So, and one more point, if I may, and that concerns another type of chronology, which is, of course, that developed by archaeologists. And the archaeologists already have a series of timescale divisions, which are very different in concept from geological ones. They're based, the archaeologists base their timescale divisions on a culture predominantly. And so we already have a mismatch if we try to define a formal boundary which doesn't coincide with what our archaeological colleagues are doing, and so on, as you've said earlier.
No, this is great. And I think one thing you just articulated pretty clearly, and I think Erle's presence on the working group demonstrates, and even having me as a journalist and even a lawyer, Davor Vidas, back in the day, is the need for a cross-disciplinary approach to this.
Yes.
Clive Hamilton and I debated some aspects of the Anthropocene off and on, and he's a philosopher in Australia, for those who don't know his name. Whether you could have a good Anthropocene being one of the questions, but he raised some interesting points in some papers that he wrote. I just want to see if I can show this. Why am I slideshow view? Hold on. It's worth bringing him into the conversation this way. At least I can realize how to remind myself how to do it. Well, I'll hold that point for a minute. I'll get that set up. Going forward here, this is a fairly momentous year for the conventional Anthropocene Working Group, right? They're still moving ahead with physically going places and doing stuff, and there's a vote or two coming up. Phil, what's going on there?
Well, we've been waiting for some time for the Anthropocene Working Group to come forward with a formal proposal, and they have done that, and we received this formal proposal in November 28th, I think it was. And within the rules of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, they have to provide an initial period for discussion, and usually that's 1 month, 30 days. And this is usually followed by voting, which is also given a period of 30 days. So we should be approaching in a date of voting effectively this weekend. In fact, it has been suggested. Now, this voting structure is also hierarchical, so it's like I've described for the stratigraphy. It's also hierarchical in the International Commission. So I should, if you'll allow me to, I should just make clear that this vote that we're awaiting will be by the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy, which is the body which is directly responsible for the stratigraphy of the Ice Age, and that the Ice Age beginning 2.58 million years ago. And so the first step is for the proposal from the working group to be voted on by the voting members of the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy. There are about 20 people who will vote on that. Now, if that achieves 60%, in other words, supermajority are in favor, then that proposal goes forward to the next step in the voting, which is which includes all the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And the people who are voting are all the chairs of the individual epoch or period subcommissions, of which there are about 20. So there's one for the Carboniferous, there's one for the Jurassic, there's one for the Precambrian, there's one for the Ordovician, etc. And again, if that vote passes at 60% or more, then that goes forward to the International Union of Geological Sciences Executive, who will vote. And if they vote in favor, then the concept of this, as you're showing on the screen, this prospective epoch series concept will be ratified and established, and that can't be changed for 10 years.
Yeah, I just want to run back through that. So there's still a two vote sequence, is that right? Or once this one subcommission votes, you're done. Yeah,
well, originally there was a vote within the working group, and they've approved it by 90%, I think, probably even 20%. 20%, sorry, 100%.
Yeah.
And then it goes to the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, who are responsible only for the Ice Age period, including the present day. And then it goes to the next step, which is by the International Union of Geological Sciences Commission on International Stratigraphy, and then ultimately up to the executive of the International Union.
So that's still a multi-year process from now.
Well, each of those steps should take 2 months.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's okay. So this is it. So this is a big moment then.
There's also the International Geological Congress happening this summer in Busan in Korea, and it's possible that the results of this voting will be announced there. They don't have to be, but if there is a decision, no doubt they will wish to announce it to the public then.
So that means a lot of reprinting of all those wall charts, theoretically.
Well, we change these charts. We change these charts every time there's a change.
Yeah.
So they're all online, and we can, and people are welcome to download these charts free of charge. Please do access them, and if you see a mistake, please let us know. We can easily update these charts, and we do so several times a year. So yes, we would have to make a change, although you will appreciate, if you look at this chart, that we can hardly see the Holocene, and if we included the Anthropocene, well, it would just have to be a note, because it would be such a short period of time, and this is only the Ice Age you see here.
Yeah, and again, it's a history book. It's not a look at the future yet. This is what's written in stone already.
Well, having said that, without monopolizing the discussion completely, I apologize to Erle for talking too much.
No, this is good.
One thing I should point out to anyone who's listening is that as geologists, we don't deal in the future.
Yeah.
Full stop.
I know, and I brought up this point before. Although there is predictive seismology in those fields, of course, distinct from stratigraphy. Geology has a predictive.
Earth science, though, more, not geology, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's
science,
true.
yeah. I mean, we could wind forward various things we have by modeling. I mean, one of the things which people have done very effectively is to take the marine isotope record, which you see on this chart.
Right.
1, 2, 3, 4. It's the fourth or fifth column, and they've wound it forward. You know, you can wind it forward, and to a certain extent, and maybe it to the left a bit more. You want to move to the left. That's it there.
Yeah.
You can use this. You can use this chart and the time scale and wind it forward for a few thousand years and get some kind of prediction. But of course, you've got to allow for human modification of the conditions. But and people have done the same kind of thing with, for example, global tectonics to look at continental drift or whatever you'd like to call it, to see where the continents might be in millions of years in the future. But of course, these are only models; they're not geological record.
So there's a question here also from Donald Carswell. What kind of practical information can be gained from further research of the Anthropocene? Erle, what would you say to that?
Well, there's lots of different kinds of research on the Anthropocene. So that's a very open question. People across the university are interested in researching the Anthropocene. And so I won't get at the bigger field, but from the point of view of what I've witnessed as a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, so in terms of geological and stratigraphical research on the Anthropocene, in my view, one of the most interesting elements that I observed was the emergence of the study of plastics as a geological phenomena. That was really a novel thing, and the archaeologists really weren't on the case on this one, and the geologists were. And so some of the very interesting stuff, like, can you date the origins of different types of plastics based on their chemistry and their location in sediment profiles in the ocean? Some of this marine plastic stuff is really fascinating, and it's novel. I don't think there was anyone else really studying that. So that brought that into play. And of course, there's a huge amount of interest now in what's going on with plastics as a global change process that's literally operating at scales from, what happens when you open a water bottle and drink it, and those plastic particles go into a human body. There's just all these different processes going on now with this thing that humans have introduced. And, plastics did not exist before. They're entirely novel.
Right.
And, obviously a lot of the interest. One thing I thought was also interesting is how, archaeology was really not included properly in the original Anthropocene Working Group. And one person came in at one point, but there was really not a robust archaeological presence in the Anthropocene Working Group. On the other hand, the Anthropocene has captured so much attention across the sciences that archaeologists are responding to this and realizing that the concept of global change and the science of global change, especially human-caused global change, is something that archaeology really has a lot to offer. And in general, archaeology hasn't focused on global change. It's focused on processual changes and cultural changes at relatively fine scales, looking at, one culture at a time, one region, this sort of thing. Putting together a global picture of how humans have transformed the planet based on archaeological evidence is really a new thing also. And so that's another thing that's emerged through the study of the Anthropocene. It's just the way it's changed archaeology.
Can I just say one thing? And that is, these barcodes we have on all our products that we buy daily, food and so on. Apparently, these can be found in dump sites, and then the date of the material can be determined. This is something which is being developed by Matt Edgeworth, who was also, along with us, a member of the working group, but he like Erle and I, resigned relatively recently.
Yeah. I want to show a slide that I, let's see, View tab, StreamYard. Why is that not working? When I was at that meeting in 2016, that was just before I left the group, I presented some slides, and this was one. You may recall at the Berlin meeting earlier, I had written about it on my blog at the Times, and I noted the absence of diversity. And Kate Raworth, the economist in England, tweeted one of the best tweets I've seen ever. The Anthropocene is bad enough. Spare me the Manthropocene. And here we are, of course, three men. Jacqueline was supposed to be with us, but has a meeting. And is going forward, what I like about your approach to these new papers on the emergent era is it's implicitly making this a multi-directional journey in scholarship and practice going forward. And when I wrote about this in 2016, I said the stratigraphic question matters for those tables and the like, but thinking about this moment going forward, we need every discipline and every variation of human involved in this question of what this emergent moment in human history is, and then how to shape it for better or worse, bringing in values and stuff. And the group still is predominantly male. Stratigraphy is one of the dustier. I shouldn't say that; it's disparaging. It's a very technical and age-old part of the geological enterprise, and my guess is it's still mainly male and mainly North American. I mean, Northern, Europe and American. How much of a change is needed there as part of this next few decades journey? Maybe Phil and then Erle.
Oh, I see. I wonder why we're on stage with David Bowie, actually.
I just love that. I found that a while back, and I thought it was a great look at how individuals can change through time too.
Yeah. Sorry, what was your question again?
About diversity and diversity of disciplines, diversity of.
Oh, I see.
Gender.
Well, yeah, this is one thing which both Erle and I, which triggered our I hope Erle would agree, triggered our approach to this idea of establishing what we call an event rather than a single issue, single period of time with a fixed basal boundary. The idea was, to reflect the fact that human influence in the natural environment started a lot earlier, and we could go back 40,000 years if we wanted,
right.
Which would put us in the middle of the last glacial period, by the way. But obviously, that influence in natural systems has started at very different times in different places. So the need for a fixed boundary seems to be really unproven, I would say. I mean, definitely there are changes, but where we wish to draw that boundary is another issue altogether. I mean, you ask about the role of women. Well, I'm fairly clear conscience about this, because we have, as you'll see in our own publication, which you've just put on the screen,
right.
There are a number of ladies involved, and what I think is even more important is that the next chair of the International Commission will be a lady professor from Italy, the first lady to take this position, but nevertheless we're doing something about it. Stratigraphy, you may think, is, as you say, a dusty, rather dull subject, but actually I can't agree with you on that. But there are a large number of females involved in this work, and it's very good to see them being involved. They're certainly the equals of we men, so it's only appropriate that they should take their role there, and I think we'll see this developing further in the future. As to future directions, well, as Erle said earlier, I don't think we can predict where that's going. But there is a slight philosophical problem here, and I don't know whether I should mention this. But the fundamental foundation of geology is based on something called uniformitarianism. It's a long word for an important foundation, and that is, put simply, it was put simply by Sir Charles Lyell, who was a major geologist who wrote a very influential textbook in the early to mid 19th century. This uniformitarian concept is that the present is the key to the past. In other words, the only way we can interpret geological sequences is by analogy with what's happening at the present day in terms of physical, chemical, biological processes, etc. Now, of course, if we say that the Anthropocene is exceptional, and of course it is in some ways, if you want to call it the the Anthropocene, there are slight problems with this concept of uniformitarianism, although of course physical chemical processes are still very much with us. So maybe that's something we need to think about in the future. But I think because we're very close to the present day, and we include the present day indeed in the Anthropocene concept, then there's much we can bring for future development of ideas and understanding of processes in the natural environment.
And Erle, some thoughts on that too. And who are the students these days? What are their goals and interests when they think about these questions?
Well, I think the most important thing I've noticed about the Anthropocene term is that people love to just take the word and go with it. Make up whatever occurs to them is attached to the Anthropocene. I've heard people, I've written a book on the Anthropocene. I've spent a lot of time with it, but I even now hear completely new definitions that are stated by people as if they're obvious facts about what the Anthropocene is. So it's a concept that people attach a lot of different meanings to. And so that, part of that you could argue is maybe just trifling, right? People are just always talking about something without really using the term in a way that improves the way people are thinking about human transformation of the planet. But on the other hand, I think it highlights the fact that people really find the term Anthropocene useful as something that people can connect to a conversation about. And that's true, just as true inside the academic world as outside the academic world. So what does it mean when one group of scientists, this isn't just science, this is a group of scientists, and in the scheme of things, a pretty small group of scientists, decides to take this word that has a very broad usage, that even has a definition in Encyclopedia Britannica already, and redefines it to make it a much more narrow definition than anyone else has been using, and uses that definition as a case for an official definition, not just one of many. When most of my time in the Anthropocene Working Group, whenever people said, well, we're going to have this formal stratigraphic definition of the Anthropocene, but it won't matter. It'll just be for our stratigraphers. Unfortunately, it won't be that simple, I think.
Right.
It's true that people will go their own way with the term, no matter what stratigraphers do. That's true. But for the sciences, the influence of the geologic timescale and these formal definitions like the Pleistocene, everyone's heard of the Pleistocene. More people have heard of the Pleistocene than the Holocene. But people who use these terms, you can't just use them however you wish. If you're a scientist, you have to use the official definition. And if the Anthropocene is defined as an epoch starting in 1952, marked in a lake in Canada, that will be the official definition that scientists generally have to use. And that will allow this very small group to create a definition that really doesn't accord with I've never heard any scientist who isn't already familiar with the Anthropocene Working Group ever think about 1950s as the beginning of the Anthropocene. Most people think about it the way Crutzen and Stormer originally did, as beginning around the time of the Industrial Revolution, sometime around then, without requiring any more detailed definition. So how this kind of formal scientific definition would interact with the broader interest in this concept remains to be seen. There may not be a formal Anthropocene epoch. I hope it doesn't get defined that way. But if it does, that's the question: is how will that influence scientific discussions about the Anthropocene and the discussions in the broader world?
Well, yeah, and I've heard. To me, this gets to something I've been trying to convey a lot in my work in the last few years, which is there are implicitly multiple definitions of words that have become emblematic, rather than the meaning of words is more as emblems than as some deeper definition of a concept. Even climate change, the term climate change is deeply abused all the time now. And it's not that even the IPCC and the Framework Convention have completely definition. They use different definitions of the term climate change. The IPCC is the Framework Convention, the 1992 treaty that everything, the Paris Agreement is all built on, in theory, only relates to greenhouse gas forced climate change. When they say climate change, that's what they're talking about. The IPCC's definition of climate change is any change in the climate. And so what's needed, especially when you start to go across disciplines, is just a pause. And this is what I mean when I say this word. I think that's a useful way to go at this too. There's been, and that, by the way, that one matters. Climate change, the treaty, there's a whole nother session to do on this. I'm actually going to touch on it on the 18th of January. If you're saying my drought was caused by climate change and I need money from the Green Fund, the Climate Fund, you could argue against that and say, well, no, there's no evidence in your part of East Africa that global warming is playing a role in your drought. And that doesn't count under the treaty. So it can end up mattering. But the first step to me is, I call them watchwords. And Anthropocene is definitely on the list. When you get into a discussion about it or using it in a journal, make sure you pause and have a little comma and say, this is what I mean when I say it. I think that
one of the things I remember very distinctly about the first Anthropocene meeting in London in 2011 was I was giving a talk and, saying things like, we da 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 da, and Oliver Morton, the editor at The Economist, raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me who you mean by we?"
Absolutely.
And that is always critical whenever you talk about the Anthropocene and you talk about humanity and these kind of totalizing words. You really do have to be careful about what perspective are you really talking about, which group. When you say we, the humans are causing the Anthropocene. Well, is everyone causing it equally? Absolutely not.
Right. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, but if you think about that's why we went for the event concept, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because we recognize that this is going to be a total disaster if we had to every time write a paper which included the word Anthropocene. We then have to say, in the sense of X, Y, Z. This is clumsy and not at all adding to the simplicity of communication. This actually runs contrary to that idea, and that's why I think the event solution is a tidy one.
Yep, because it can fit into your geological stratigraphic box and also still have that wider plasticity. I'm here to help sustain this conversation. I'm just showing a slide that I use, which gets at the importance of defining your terms. This is the Framework Convention climate change definition and the IPCC definition, and they're completely different. So
it's important perhaps to just reflect, though, that changing climate is natural. It may have different forcing mechanisms, but the record, at least of the last however many million years, you could go back to the Cretaceous, the so-called period of the dinosaurs were at their acme, as it were, and that was considered to be hothouse conditions. We're now living in what's called icehouse conditions. And so since the end of the Cretaceous, that's about 90 million years ago, we've gone through a whole series of perfectly natural climate changes, obviously not driven by humans, but climate change is normal. And it's just that the impact of humans on climate change, and of course it's at all sorts of different levels as well.
Right.
And then where does climate cease and weather begin? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, and again, to me, a lot of this gets to just defining your terms, and also, I mean, as you know, we get into these arguments quite often with people who are deeply skeptical about the human forcing on the climate system. Yeah, climate change has changed profoundly. Climate has changed profoundly all through Earth history, but that doesn't mean that a new forcing can't emerge. Meaning, what we're doing through
Precisely.
greenhouse gas change.
Yeah, sure.
So this has been really, really helpful. And I'd like to, keep at it. We could, as I told Erle, I could do a whole series of conversations on this, and we'll get Jacqueline back on. And the technosphere, I was really interested to see your new paper on the moon, because one of my tiny contributions to the Anthropocene Working Group was when we were doing the paper on the technosphere. There was a conversation that took place where I said, yeah, let's make sure that the orbital part of the human enterprise is in there. All the satellites, all those the Elon Musk satellites will probably come out of Earth orbit, but there'll be a lot of junk up there, and that we're developing a ring essentially around the Earth. And there's a body of scholarship that got added into the paper because I was in the room. So that's kind of cool. So thank you, Erle Ellis and Phil Gibbard, for being here today for a Sustain What conversation on all the dimensions of the Anthropocene, however you would like to define it. I think your conception has a lot of value. If I were still on the group, I would be taking that into account, and really it's
the only one.
What's that?
I said you'd be the only one.
Yeah, probably. I guess it's a group that's self-sustaining a certain trajectory at this point.
Yes. It's kind of become a bit of an echo chamber, I think.
Well, and that's why, the more we can broaden out, the better. And I'd like to get Jan on here and others from the group to explore in an open way.
It would be wonderful to have an actual discussion between people who are supporting the event definition versus the epoch definition. Not as a debate. I mean, the debate might be interesting too, but I'd like to just hear a discussion, because it hasn't really been a good discussion. It's kind of been two different views that are not really crossing paths very much anymore.
I know. I think we all agree on that. And I'm just going to, this is one of the slides I showed in 2016 at the Anthropocene Working Group meeting, when I was there as sort of the outlying lay person, and said, whatever we're doing in our fields, we have our definitions and our rules, just as Phil had explained, but the concepts are, as Erle really articulated very well, spill out everywhere, and less defensiveness and worry about those outside interpretations is really important. Davor Vidas there said varied interpretations are inevitable, and I said embrace this and emphasize its normalcy, but at the same time explain how stratigraphic Anthropocene designations is rooted in data and is a picture of what is good, bad, or indifferent. Let the values discussions play out. As I quote Maurice Sendak sometimes, let the wild rumpus, play forward, and don't think you're going to own the term, and you can own your space for the term, and get comfortable with that. It is complicated. I'll be very interested to track the vote. I'm not going to say where I think it's going to go. I have my doubts that this will go forward, but you never know. So thanks. This is Sustain What? This is Andy Revkin, Erle Ellis in Zanzibar at the moment, normally in Baltimore area, Phil Gibbard in Cambridge, UK, and share this. It's on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. As soon as we're done, you can share it and build conversations around it going forward. And then a last comment came in from Donald Carswell. Thank you for your time. I learned several new things from your conversation. Appreciate it. Also like the idea of discussing event versus epoch as a layman. Cheers. So I'll say cheers too.
All right.